everyone. Next, we'll be looking at some tools and techniques for developing a project charter. The first one we'll look at is called brainstorming. The brainstorming technique is something I think many of you use regularly. When we want to gather more information or generate more ideas, we might get together to discuss things. We're free to let our imaginations run wild. We encourage everyone to share information. The rule here is the more, the better. We don't judge any piece of information. Why do we do that? Because once you start judging information, people are hesitant to speak their minds or share anything further. So we aim to gather as much information as possible. It's a way of finding the best ideas through volume. So that's what brainstorming is. It's about gathering together to explore ideas and collect a wealth of information. So we use the term bold assumptions. When we make these bold assumptions, we might come up with seemingly absurd, but actually useful and valuable ideas. This is a way to brainstorm ideas, right? And usually after brainstorming, we get a lot of information. To deal with all that information, we use a tool called an affinity diagram. Let me write it down. Affinity diagram. We'll use the affinity diagram method to categorize this kind of information, to cluster them. In other words, this information all refers to the same thing about a certain topic. We'll group them together. Some other information by brainstorming yielded lots of information. I'll refer to this one topic. We group these ideas together. We classify them into different categories. This is how we group them. We form several groups. Once grouped, we can distill them further to extract key insights that are more valuable. After distillation, we need to select the best ones. We'll use a technique called the Nominal Group Technique. Employing the Nominal Group Technique, also known as NGT, we vote on and rank these ideas. We'll see which rank higher and which rank lower. This voting process is actually a careful verification process. Ultimately, the result is what we take from this brainstorming session. We finally decide what to implement. So that's brainstorming and the Nominal Group Technique. Just know that if we need to gather a lot of information about an unknown and manage it promptly, brainstorming can be used as the focus groups. They help categorize the results from brainstorming by voting and ranking them. Let's move on to another tool for project development called expert judgment. This involves an expert. I should clarify something here. It's not some old guy with a white beard you see on TV or some old lady with white hair. So what does it mean? It refers to individuals with academic qualifications, specialized knowledge in specific fields. It could be skills or experience, and it also refers to those who have undergone professional training. The input provided by these individuals is known as expert judgment. So for everyone here, after you've completed this course, when it comes to project management and you offer your insights, that's considered expert judgment. Here's a more everyday example. If you've ever been in love and your younger cousins want to start dating, you might say, let me give you some advice about how to navigate a relationship. That's also expert judgment. So you've been through this before. You've gained some first-hand experience, or maybe you've had some training. You've got some understanding of this. All that is what we call expert judgment. This technique is widely used in our PMP. It's used practically everywhere, in 35 processes to be exact. In other words, including creating the project charter and things like all 7 processes in project integration management, expert judgment. This includes scope management, schedule management, cost management, quality management, resource management, communication management, risk management, procurement management, and stakeholder management. In every field, there are processes that call for expert judgment. So it's a very common tool. And you just need to remember, if any of us provides valuable information, whether from experience, personal knowledge, things you've learned, or from training, either way is fine. They all fall under expert judgment. There are also some tools. Let's take a look at them. These tools, we'll briefly go over them. Since this exam is on strategy, it won't go into much depth. We'll cover them in detail, which are more heavily tested. The more frequently tested areas, I will explain in detail later. First, let's talk about conflict management. As we've discussed before, where there are people, there's a social arena. There will be conflicts of opinions. Conflicts can arise. Even your teeth can bite your tongue, let alone between people. Having conflicts is not necessarily a bad thing, because many times it's the conflicts that trigger us to think. Conflicts trigger thinking, and that's how we move forward. So conflict is not necessarily bad. Of course, destructive conflicts are definitely bad, those we should avoid. Once we acknowledge that conflict is not necessarily bad, we can move on. Let's take another look. What's the goal of conflict management? When we manage conflict, it actually involves many factors. To reach a consensus on this information, to reach a unified view. In other words, whether it's to achieve a goal or to address high-level needs, the project description, the overall logical background, and other related information, we need to reach a unified view. This covers what we'll address in conflict management. But as for managing conflict itself, we'll explore that in later sections. We'll cover that more in resource management. Another tool we use is called facilitation. This can also be known as a facilitated workshop, meaning there's a facilitator who leads. They'll gather everyone for a meeting. These are usually people from cross-functional teams. These people are from cross-functional teams. So remember these two terms, cross-functional team. A cross-functional team means to discuss things. What's the advantage? The biggest advantage is when you meet with people from a specific field, they only focus on their area. When you meet with another team, they focus on their own area, but with multiple teams together, you'll find they can, when working on the same project, each person has a different perspective. This makes it easier to spot issues. You can't solve a problem until you identify it. That's why holding meetings with cross-functional teams makes it easier to identify problems and resolve them. So that's about facilitating cross-functional team meetings. The third tool is meeting management. Meeting management is essentially about how to conduct efficient meetings. This is also a crucial part of project resource management. We'll cover that in detail in a later chapter. But first, let's get a brief overview. Here's what we know. To hold an efficient meeting, the agenda must be clear, as must be the process, and it should follow that process. Someone needs to chair it to keep the discussion on track and focused on these topics. After the meeting, there should be a summary and a review. Once the meeting is over, minutes need to be taken and distributed to everyone. The action items from the meeting need to be implemented. These will be followed up on at the next meeting. That's how you run an efficient meeting. We'll go into more detail on that later. Let's get a brief overview first. In fact, the tool we just looked at, take a brainstorming session like this. Does it actually utilize this type of meeting? Do we need to use it? Our focus groups? Do we need this kind of meeting? We need it either way. And this includes when we're brainstorming, what role does each person play? Is he an expert's role? When we form focus groups, when we're voting, what role does it play? Is he supposed to provide expert judgment? Right, these tools are inherently integrated. They work together. Next, let's look at the outputs of developing the project charter. One key output document is the project charter. Another is the assumption log. What's the assumption log? When we're working on something, we usually have some underlying assumptions. A lot of assumptions. These assumptions, they can actually help move the project forward, make it progress faster. But of course, if those assumptions turn out to be false, they might pose some risks to the project. For example, say you're building a road. This road happens to pass through a village. It might run through someone's property or through someone's ancestral burial ground. In this case, before construction begins, before we start building the road, we have to make certain assumptions. We assume that land acquisition and any demolition work are already completed. Then we can proceed. Without these assumptions, the project can move forward. Then we'd never get started. That's right. When we're working on a project, there are often many assumptions like this. Another factor is called constraints. So what are constraints? Simply put, you can only spend 5 million on this project. You can go over 5 million. This 5 million is a budgetary constraint. You have to finish it in 3 months. So the 3-month limit is a constraint on the schedule. There are many different requirements in various aspects. Those are all constraints. Assumptions and constraints normally should be documented in the project charter. But when we're working on a project, we usually separate out these assumptions and constraints into a separate document. That document is called the assumption log. What does log mean? Let's start with a simple definition. In ancient times, for example, foreigners, when they went sailing, their ships were made of wood. They would use the wood to carve records, saying, "Oh, the weather's great today. I didn't get seasick today," and so on. After recording this information, these logs became a record of the voyage, a record of their journey. We'll refer to this information as logs. In English, it's called a log. We'll use log to represent the file. The assumption log is essentially a specific file. That file contains a large number of these assumptions and constraints. So that's the idea. In other words, as we move forward with a project, there will be some underlying assumptions and constraints. We try to identify all of them. Identify as many of these constraints as possible. What advantages do these assumptions offer? This is for when we assess risks later on. Evaluate these assumptions and constraints still hold true or are still valid. If they are no longer valid, it could lead to new risks, which we must address